Good morning and welcome to the 13th meeting of the Finance and Constitution Committee. Today we'll take evidence on Brexit from the Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, Europe and External Affairs. This committee has considered a number of pieces of Brexit-related legislation and inquiries over the past few years, and no doubt we will continue to do so. But this is a timely opportunity to have an update on where we are, and we're joined for this item this morning by Michael Russell, who is the Cabinet Secretary for the Constitution, Europe and External Affairs, Ewan Page, who's the Head of UK Frameworks Unit, and David Barnes, who's the Deputy Director of the Head of the EU Exit Strategy and Negotiations. Cabinet Secretary, I warmly welcome you to the meeting and I invite you, if you wish, to make a short opening statement.
Thank you very much, Convener, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to say a word or two before I'm open to question. I just want to inform the committee at the very start of this that today we have published the Continuity Bill, which will give the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government powers to keep pace with EU legislation, as well as introducing principles of environmental governance and establishing a new body, and I'm happy to answer questions on that. I suspect I will be back to talk to the committee about that at some stage in the near future. The issues around are difficult and complex, but I think the present situation can be summarised by saying that the current negotiations are deadlocked, and they're deadlocked not because of a difficulty on detail, but a difficulty on politics. The fourth and most recent round finished on the 5th of June. As members will know, the Prime Minister met with the President of the European Commission, the President of the Council and the President of the Parliament this week on Monday. And although there was an announcement about further intensification of negotiation, there was no political breakthrough. And in reality, the two sides have very fundamental differences. Now, the Scottish Government's position is clear. It is taken as read that we do not support Brexit, and of course the people of Scotland did not vote for Brexit. And I hope we won't get hung up on that today, because that is the fact of the situation. But we have tried to work with the UK government, as the Welsh, for example, government have tried with the UK government, to find compromises. And we found it's not increasingly difficult, actually impossible by now. The rejection very early on of the Single Market and Customs Union option was a bad start. But presently, the discussions between the governments are essentially very difficult to progress because the UK government does not provide information, does not listen to the devolved administrations, and indeed does not respect devolution and how it operates. This, I have to say, got to a very difficult state last Friday, where both the Welsh Government and ourselves decided not to attend a ministerial briefing from the Paymaster General on the Van der Leyden meeting, prior to the Van der Leyden meeting, because we felt that there had been no respect shown to the opinions and points of view we had put forward, particularly with regard to the an extension. The extension will be, I think, a crucial discussion today. The UK can request an extension to the present transition period up until the end of this month. After the end of this month, it would become very difficult indeed to get that transition, largely because the decision from the EU would have to be a mixed decision, which would require the involvement of all 27 and perhaps their parliaments as well. The impact of COVID-19 has been enormous on the capability of every government, and indeed on the finances of every government. And it is inconceivable that a government could go ahead with something as complex as the Brexit negotiations and expect to have them completed and implemented within the next 6 months. That simply is not feasible. And to go ahead with that is reckless, because it also places business in this country at a huge disadvantage. It will be very difficult for COVID, and every business knows that, to have the additional burden of Brexit and not knowing what the outcomes will be and not knowing what new arrangements will be is just adds an impossibility. A huge number of people have said this to the UK government. They have been completely impervious to reason. There is also a real possibility that there cannot be the type of democratic scrutiny that is required for such a huge constitutional change. So last Friday, I think the issue came to a head, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster announced ex cathedra that there was to be no extension without even paying any attention to a letter from the First Ministers from Scotland and Wales, which had gone to the Prime Minister requesting that extension be sought. And I have to say that covering from that situation will be hard. My work department myself wrote to Michael Gove on Tuesday of this week with a series of proposals to try and reset the discussions between the countries. We've not had a response yet. We did take part in a meeting with Penny Mordaunt, the Paymaster General, on a Tuesday, but it was simply a readout of the Johnson van der Leyen meeting, and in fact there was not a single thing in it that we could not have gleaned from the newspapers. And that unfortunately tends to be the reality of meetings. One of the things we have suggested is the primary of the JMC-EN needs to be re-established. The JMC-EN, which was established in October 2016, has a written terms of reference, and that written terms of reference includes oversight of negotiations insofar as the effect of devolved administration. It has to be brought back into place, and it has to be treated seriously. It was agreed between the four countries. I don't want to say very much more, except to say that we would like to continue with discussions with the UK because there are vital issues at stake within the negotiations. They have to put us in a position where our input is meaningful, not simply pro forma. And that is a position shared, I have to say, ourselves and the Welsh Government, but so far we find that the UK Government is not listening. I'm happy to open to question.
Cabinet Secretary, thank you. Can you tell us, please, what's been the main impact of COVID-19 on the Scottish Government's work in preparing for the end of the transition period? You tell us there's been an enormous impact, and given that it looks increasingly unlikely that the transition period will be extended, what will be the ongoing impact on managing the Scottish Government's Brexit process while we're dealing with the COVID emergency?
We announced in mid-March, before lockdown, that would suspend the work we were undertaking on independence and the preparations for the independence referendum in order to focus entirely on COVID. That was the right thing to do, but it was also the necessary thing to do because all the work that was being done on, for example, on the main Brexit discussions and on the independence discussions, the people doing that work had to then focus on the issue of COVID. And that meant that the vast majority of officials have been spending their time on COVID-related issues. For example, I have officials who have been working on testing. I've been officials working on regulations. I took, as members know, the responsibility for the COVID legislation and the COVID regulations, the detailed work. I've taken 2 bills to the Scottish Parliament in that time, emergency bills, and I will be, I think, Mr. Fraser is deputy convener of this committee, but as convener of COVID, I think he's expected to hear from me Wednesday, both on the reporting on the bills and on the regulations. Now, that was the right thing to do, but it's been very detailed work. And to be fair, the UK government has been doing the same. The vast majority of officials have moved into that type of work. Now that we are being expected to say that we're going to draw those people back, and reluctantly I will have to draw some of those people back to prepare for other work, and the continuity bill is an example. We would not have introduced a continuity bill at this stage. It would have remained to one side had we not got to the stage that we need the powers in terms of keeping pace by the end of this year. And therefore, the last date that we could introduce it to allow a committee to take evidence over the summer, to invite evidence over the summer, was the 18th of June. So we've gone to the very, very last day in order to move forward. So the work of the government is the first thing. The second thing is the financial burdens that exist. I mean, we have undertaken huge expenditure, not all of which has come back from consequentials. The reality is we do not have money to spare to spend upon any set of activities, and that's going to be pressure, ongoing pressure. The third issue is scrutiny. If we come to discuss the frameworks, there is a commitment to bring the frameworks, when they are concluded, to Parliament for scrutiny. As of today, I expect there to be over 100 pieces of secondary legislation coming to the Parliament as a result of the continuation of these of the transition period, and it's the desire of the UK government to conclude it by the end of December. Now, I mean, that is certainly of a level very similar to what we had for the preparation of the no deal last year. And that's going to be an administrative burden. And finally, there is the issue of no deal preparation and planning. Over and above what I'm describing here, we are now going to have to reactivate the no deal preparation and planning. Because whatever the outcome is, if there is an outcome, it will either be no deal or a low deal. I think that's quite clear, because the ambition of the UK in the negotiations is for nothing more than that. So if it is a low deal or a no deal, there will have to be substantial planning for very difficult times ahead. So all of those things come to bear. And it defies belief that a sensible government would not say, look, we've got an opportunity to slow things down here. We don't have to abandon our principles. I would love Brexit to be out of the way, but that's not what I've been asking for. What they could do is slow things down in order to ensure that those pressures are not put into the system. To refuse to do so is reckless and damaging, particularly when we are apparently facing the worst recession, according to the Financial Times, of since 1709. Now, I was not there and you were not there, so we can't say whether that is true. But I have to say that if that is even partially true, then it's the height of folly to continue.
Thanks, Cabinet Secretary. I pick up on one specific area you've just covered yourself in regard to the impact of COVID-19 on business, because Cabinet Secretary, you'll be aware that for a number of years this committee has been discussing the area of common frameworks, and until today I'm only aware of one draft common framework that's been published. Now, I appreciate that part of that reason might be the impact of COVID-19, but you've just told us today that over 100 common frameworks will be required to... Sorry, you want to clarify that then?
100 pieces of secondary legislation, not 100 pieces of common frameworks.
Okay, forgive me. But in that case, can you tell us how many frameworks the Parliament will be expected to consider before the end of the transition period? And can you also tell us whether temporary arrangements will need to be put in place, so there's any policy areas where common frameworks haven't been agreed by the end of the transition, but where there is an understanding that that will be needed?
Yes, the common frameworks issue is immensely complicated by the refusal of the UK government to agree on the issue of level playing field. And it will also be complicated by whatever happens with the Northern Ireland Protocol. And there is considerable concern that there is an attempt to renegotiate the withdrawal agreement and the protocol. And indeed, I noticed Michael Gove yesterday expressing dissatisfaction with aspects of the Northern Ireland Protocol and saying that it would not be acceptable, even though it is part of an international treaty and a binding treaty. So there are big difficulties there conceptually on the frameworks issue and in terms of how we move the issue forward. But the four-country board on the frameworks has already concluded that you could not finish this work this year. And that's quite clear. The impact of COVID has had a huge effect upon it. We would hope that 3 full frameworks might be completed by the end of the year. And remember, we're talking in the region of 23, 24. There's still quite a bit of variety. Nutritional labelling, compositional standards, emission trading systems, food and feed safety and hygiene law look as if they might be able to become this year. The first of those would be emissions trading, for which the consultation with stakeholders has been completed, and that would be the first one to come to the Parliament. But that's not guaranteed. That's essentially the best case. That would leave, in terms of full frameworks, another 5 which were outstanding. And then in terms of we'd have to make interim arrangements, then they range from fisheries management and support, which is of course closely related to the negotiations, as is, for example, agricultural support, right down to issues such as late payment and commercial transactions. So those would all need to be in the pipeline. Now, that is considerably less than any of us would have wanted, but I'm also saying that none of them might be possible if there is no agreement on level playing field. Because if there's no agreement on level playing field, it's very difficult to see what the basis is of these common frameworks, particularly with the involvement of Northern Ireland. So there is no certainty that this could happen. But best case, I would imagine we might get 3 through.
Okay, well, my final question, Cabinet Secretary, 100 pieces of secondary legislation, 3 common frameworks, a number of temporary arrangements between now and the end of the year. My question is, in terms of enabling the Parliament to properly scrutinise either the secondary legislation or indeed the common frameworks themselves, what discussions have been held with between yourselves and the Parliament about how best we can go about that process in this current COVID emergency? Because obviously, not only are the resources of government stretched and finding it difficult to deal with the circumstances, that is also true of the resources of Parliament. But Parliament must have its role in this regard, and it must be able to scrutinise what's going on, regardless of the difficulty and the circumstances. I think that's an imperative.
I absolutely, we've said that the Parliament must be engaged in the frameworks centrally and must be able to approve the frameworks. That's a commitment we made. And on the secondary legislation, that is, we have an existing protocol, as you know. The Minister for Parliamentary Business is now in the process. I mean, we only knew about the number of pieces of secondary legislation. In fact, we've only got an estimate. That is an estimate that we have. But we've only had that in the last week or so. We'll be raising this with the parliamentary authorities. We're raising it with the business managers. And we are talking, of course, about this being from August onwards. And some of those will not be clear. Some of these will absolutely not be clear until there is a deal, if there is a deal. Now, if you look at the timescale that the UK government has set itself, that is 5 rounds of negotiation up to the end of August, with the most optimistic view that some sort of arrangement might be entered into by September, you're then really saying being only able to put that stuff into place for consideration in September, October, November, December, at a time when the Parliament is still struggling to get back to full stage. I mean, this just illustrates how ridiculous this is, because we don't need to do it this way. We could quite reasonably say, let us be a pause for the next period.
Okay, I'm just going to move now to Alec Rowley, Cabinet Secretary. All that work that you're talking about, of course, will coincide with a substantial effort that the Parliament and the Government is going to have to make around budgetary matters, and that these two matters coinciding will cause significant workload challenges. But that said, Alec Rowley.
Thanks, Convener. I had intended, Cabinet Secretary, to ask you about current relationships and negotiation and discussion between the UK and involved administrations, but you kind of touched on that in your introduction. So if I could perhaps put it another way, I remember in the period after the EU referendum, I think the Scottish Tories, for example, were arguing that the Scottish Parliament would be far more powerful because all those powers that are coming back for Europe in devolved areas would come back to the Scottish Parliament. My own party for that argued that there should be no power grab, that we should see these substantial powers coming back. Is this a power grab taking place with the UK government?
Well, my view is there's been a continuing power grab by the UK government, that they've never gone away from that, and I think some of the issues which may be on the horizon in terms of so-called UK single market will intensify that. My own view is that there is a low tolerance of devolution from the current UK government, and that they are always unhappy if the devolved competencies are drawn to their attention by the devolved administrations. But I do think, we did our very best on the frameworks. I mean, we worked very, very hard to put those in place, but they are jeopardised again by the refusal of the UK government to accept level playing field and other such issues. Now, that's all aside from failure to get any progress on the intergovernmental review, which I think is very serious, and there has been no progress on that whatsoever. Convener, I understand also my video is not being sent because of the difficulties of the line. I apologise for that. I think I do live in a rural part of Argyll, and as a result of which sometimes there's a problem with the quality of the broadband, I look forward to it being improved.
So in terms of, you said yourself that these are very technical and complex issues. From a layperson point of view, looking at this, is it simply an argument between politicians about where decision making sits, or what is the implications of this for the people of Scotland in their everyday life? So in terms of regulation, for example, people are genuinely concerned about dodgy chicken and dodgy food. So food standards going down as a result of any Brexit deal and then the trade deals that would follow for that, workers' rights, health and safety. I mean, for people up and down Scotland, why is this such a big issue? Is it just about where the decisions are made, or what are the ramifications of those decisions for people?
I think that's a really important question. The ramifications are clear for people. I mean, you are right about dodgy chicken and and beef imports. It is very interesting that the UK Trade Ambassador, representative yesterday, made it absolutely clear in public that there would be no trade deal with the UK for the US unless meat was allowed to be part of the deal. Now, I suspect that applies to a number of other things, right up to and including private healthcare. Now, the way to avoid this for the people of Scotland is, short of independence, and Alec, you're no surprised I believe in independence, but short of independence, the way to avoid this in Scotland is to have a rigid view of the devolved competencies and to make sure that the Scottish Parliament can operate in that way. And that means that there should not be issues such as food safety or healthcare or any area within the competence of the Scottish Parliament without the full involvement of the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government. That is not happening. That is not happening on two levels. It's not happening on the level of the discussions between the governments that are meant to oversee the talks. I use that word oversight again. That word oversight is in the remit of the GMC. And it's not happening in terms of, for example, the trade bill. The Parliament will eventually, I'm sure, be asked its opinion of the trade bill. We've published material on how you should have a modern trading bill, which would recognise these issues and make sure that devolved administrations were closely involved. Westminster has no intention of doing that, none whatsoever. So the impact upon daily lives is great. Now that's why there should be, even we can pursue the issue of independence. I'd like to do so, but I'm happy to do so in this context. But that's why there should be, and the Welsh government have supported this, intergovernmental system, so that we all know what the rules are, we all know how it operates, we all know what the dispute resolution procedure is, and it's fair and equitable. And the Welsh Labour government has published on this and said sovereignty should lie within each of the countries, and that we should willingly pool that sovereignty, but that's how it should work. There's no intention of going anywhere near that. The intention, if anything, is to intensify this medieval concept of the sovereignty of the Westminster Parliament, and to try and diminish anything else, and that will have an effect on the daily lives of everybody in Scotland. And that I've been regrettably been in these talks for 4 years, and that is my conclusion of where they are and what the intentions are.
So, as Cabinet Secretary in Scotland, did you have any idea at all where the UK government was heading? I mean, I think the Parliament was united in the past in saying that we needed to get a deal that took us much closer to the EU market and alignment with the customs union. That was the view, I think, unanimously within the Scottish Parliament, and I assume that's the view that the Scottish Government on our behalf has been pushing. Do we know, are we going to get any place near that? I mean, do you have any idea where we're going to end up?
Is that your final question, Alec? Just before...
Yes. Sorry, yes.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry, Cabinet Secretary.
There are two possible landing zones for this. One is that the current UK government has a change of heart, accepts that the devolved administration should be actively involved in issues to do with their devolved competences, changes the way in which they're operating towards the EU, and seeks a better deal which is a deal which I don't want to leave the EU, but it does so in terms which are possible to live with, or it continues down its path, gets a no deal or a low deal, and that means that for the people of Scotland there is double, triple, or quadruple whammy. Certainly it will reduce food standards. Certainly it will imperil public services. Certainly it will impinge upon devolution. And certainly it will create the circumstances in which the UK is undertaking approaches which are damaging to all of us. That is where it is going. Now, a no deal would be particularly disastrous, but a low deal would be pretty bad too. Now, I am always hopeful that some sense will enter into it, but I can't see any at the present moment.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary Alexander Burnett.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. My question's on the UK Common Frameworks and the process. Now, I understand that you stopped your officials engaging back in March 2019. I was wondering, is this true, and will you be looking to engage going forward?
No, that's not true. If you're talking about frameworks, that's not true. We've been actively engaged in frameworks all the time and continue to be actively engaged in frameworks. That's why I'm able to say that the work on, for example, on the emissions trading system is complete. So if that is not true about frameworks, no.
Thank you for that. I'm very glad to hear it. Well, really, finally, then, given the bulk of Scotland's trade, goes to the rest of the UK, and given that nearly 500,000 people got voted to remain part of the UK, and voted to remain part of the EU, can we just continue to have your assurance that you'll continue to prioritise engaging with the UK government constructively on this?
Well, no, what I'll prioritise, Mr. Burnett, is what you should prioritise too, working for the people who elected you. And the people who elected you in your constituency, as in mine, in the majority voted to stay in the EU. That's an indisputable fact. Now, what we've tried to do, I think, as hard as we possibly can, is to negotiate with the UK government to get an outcome that would be agreeable insofar as we could to all of us. The UK government have failed to offer that on any occasion. On the issue of business of trading, if you're telling me that the UK government has suddenly decided not to trade with the EU because it is not to be a member of the EU, I would actually, given their ideological obsessions, I wouldn't be surprised, but I think it would be very foolish. There is absolutely no reason why people can't trade with each other who are not part of the same political or organisation. We see that all the time. I have all this flim-flam about dealing, new trade deals with Australia and New Zealand, which is flim-flam. I mean, if you look at the government's own figures, the New Zealand deal would have zero impact upon GDP. But I would point out, as I'm sure you know, that New Zealand and Australia are neither neighbours of ours, nor are they part of the same political unit, yet they continue to trade. So if you are telling me that there would be no trade between Scotland and England because we're not part of the same political unit, then the implications of that for the UK would be very severe if that became the principle by which they were operating. Much more severe than they would be for Scotland.
Angela Constance.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the Cabinet Secretary. Mr Russell will remember the findings from the Public Accounts and Constitutional Affairs Committee, a Westminster committee that concluded that despite 20 years of devolution, Westminster neither understood, never minded paid due respect to the devolved settlement. I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary is aware of another report from another Westminster committee that has a Tory majority. It's the Committee on the Future Relationships with Europe that published a new report which is urging the UK government to take steps to improve involvement from devolved administrations. And they heard evidence from Kirsty Hughes, who says that the Joint Ministerial Committee forum is not being used as a serious forum. In fact, I think it's only met once this year. So I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary could say what he thinks should happen to improve this, How urgent is this, and how it would help?
Thank you. Yes, I'm familiar with the Westminster committees that have been looking at this, and indeed I'm in front of the PACAC Committee, Constitutional Affairs, Westminster Committee, Tuesday. Every examination of the joint ministerial structure, I mean, almost since the beginning of devolution, has regarded it as not fit for purpose. And that's whether that's Westminster committees, Scottish Parliament committees in other devolved areas, or academic study. All of them have come to the same conclusion. I've often said that the weight of Brexit was too great for devolution to bear, and even what wasn't working terribly well became even worse. If you look at the JMC itself, the JMC plenary has not met since December 2018, when Theresa May was Prime Minister. Boris Johnson has never attended because there hasn't been one, a JMC plenary. The JMC-EN, which is the only other functioning part of the JMC at the present moment, the JMC Europe was abolished without reference to the devolved administration, so it tells you quite a lot. The JMC-EN met, as you say, it's actually met twice this year. It met physically on January the 28th, 29th in Cardiff, and it met virtually on May the 21st. But these meetings are really pretty pro forma now. It has a written remit. I've quoted that several times. That remit is, one part of it was to agree on the Article 50 process. The committee was never shown the Article 50 letter. Nobody saw the letter. So in those circumstances, it wasn't allowed to fulfill its function pretty early on. It's still not fulfilling its function. Now, to do something about this, there was an agreement at, I think, March or May 2018. I need to look at the exact figures, the exact dates, to re-examine the intergovernmental relationships. There was to be an intergovernmental review, and that started then, and it has wound its way on, but nothing has happened. We expected, I mean, clearly changes of administration didn't help that, but we expected there was an agreement in June 2019 in Manchester, the last meeting that David Lidington was at, that there would be a progress of two sorts by the end of 2019. It didn't happen. We were assured that we would see material in January 2020 in Cardiff, from Michael Gove, which would make proposals. We never saw it. Still nothing. Now, during that time, Mark Drakeford, who was my opposite number, is now Welsh Minister, and myself have made, I think, substantive contributions through lectures at the Institute for Government in London. The Welsh have published a paper on these matters. We've all brought to the table views of how the intergovernmental relationship and the JMC process might be improved, but the UK has brought nothing at all. And my view is they're not interested. The improvement of these relationships is not something that is a priority for them. Indeed, they regard it as threatening, and they are not going to bring forward anything particularly serious. Now, I regret that. I don't think it will be enough, but we need improvement, and I've always said I will back improvement. The last small improvement actually came from both David Lidington and Damien Green, his predecessor, who slimlined the JMC-EN, which was becoming completely bloated with people turning up, and made it a bit more effective, and also made sure that there wasn't a preponderance of UK ministers and officials who simply swamped devolved administrations. That was always a problem in the JMC structure. I once attended many years ago, I think in 2010, maybe 2009 actually, I attended a JMC Europe, which had, if I remember correctly, 23 UK ministers, myself and Rhodri Morgan. So it wasn't, there was no equity in the process at all. Unless there's a serious commitment from the UK to this, it's not going anywhere. And even if there was, the only acceptable movement would be one that treated the four partners equally. And I think that's a very long way from the UK's mind.
My final question, Convener, is that given that 83% of Scots polled want to see or are in favour of an extension to the Brexit transition, and actually 70% of people across the UK are also in favour of that too, but as the Cabinet Secretary indicated earlier, that it would appear highly unlikely that the UK government will seek an extension to the transition period. So given that in terms of the actual Brexit negotiations, there appears to be disagreements and no progress. And in terms of the UK government's intransigence in dealing not just with the Scottish Government, but also other devolved administrations, where the Cabinet Secretary has described, again, no progress, intractable disagreements and no clarity on how processes can be resolved. Are we not heading for an absolute calamity?
I agree with you. I mean, I think we're in an absolute calamity at the present moment in terms of these relationships, and I think failing to agree to an extension makes that calamity even worse. I mean, I cannot see that this will end in anything but tears. And there will be, as Alec Rowley referred to earlier, there will be very substantial damage done to ordinary people in Scotland. But the UK government seem hell bent upon it, and nobody, regrettably, in the Scottish Conservative Party appears to be standing against it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to George Adam. The one difficulty of course, doing virtual stuff like this, Cabinet Secretary, is you can't see what I'm thinking or any signals that I'm making. I just wonder if you could keep your questions a wee bit tighter. I think it would help us in terms of time that we have. I'm sorry to ask you to do that, but I think it would help everybody. George Adam.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I'd like to ask you about the financial challenges we have ahead with COVID-19 and Brexit itself. Now, only about 2 or 3 hours ago, we heard that the UK debt mountain has soared in May to 55.2 billion. That's adding to the 1.59 trillion debt that they currently have. Now, this is 9 times higher than in May 2019. Now, a lot of that has been used to deal with the current crisis we're in. But surely, Cabinet Secretary, the challenge that we have at the moment is with us coming out of this crisis. That's difficult enough. Surely it's a complete folly for us, for the UK government, to continue down this Brexit path.
I'm tempted to follow the convener's injunction and just say yes. I agree with you. It is complete folly, and it will cost us a great deal of money. And we have not received yet, as much as we have paid out. And just as Brexit was too heavy for devolution to bear, I think COVID is far too heavy for devolution to bear too, and the financial implications of it are horrendous.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The problem I have, and we all have, is that we have constituents who will be struggling with day-to-day issues on the coming out of coronavirus crisis, of employment, economic stability. And is it not the case that we need to continue working closely with other nations in the world and make sure that we get to a place where we can actually say, let's get out of this issue, let's bin Brexit for the current time, and let's look at another way of working this out?
Yes, and obviously international cooperation and learning from each other is very important, and there's a lot of that discussion that is going on, but also international collaboration on things like purchase of PPE. The UK's attitude to that was pretty disastrous. They're not taking part, as far as I understand, in this joint activity to make sure that there's understanding of the lockdown right across Europe and how it is changing and how it is being reduced and changed in each place and what the border issues are. It's that refusal to participate in Europe that is problematic. At a time, for example, when there's a new European Health Fund being established, which there will be very substantial resources on research into COVID, and that's the type of thing we should be involved in. I think it's the wrong thing at the wrong time.
Finally, Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned earlier that there's little prospect of any positive outcome to the current negotiations with the UK government with Europe. Now, can you expand further on this? Because what we have discussed with regards to negotiations, this is, again, I'm coming at this from a very basic level of our constituents who are living their day-to-day life. This affects them in a massive way. And if the UK government is going to be gung-ho with this position, surely we've got to be thinking about our own constituents and who we represent and trying to find a better way through all this.
Well, of course that is the case. I mean, I think I responded to somebody in questions yesterday by saying that it's not just a question of whether or not there is a deal. The question is what type of deal and can it be implemented in time? Now, the UK is going for a very unambitious deal that will change the protections that people have. That it is, for example, they do not wish to sign on to the European Convention of Human Rights. There are all sorts of things they don't want to do. This will diminish opportunity and it will diminish protections and it will be damaging, and that's simply the fact of the matter. So whatever it will be a very poor deal. It will be very hard to implement in the period required. In fact, it will be impossible to implement before the end of the year, with a lot of chaos arising out of it, and people will suffer.
Murdo Fraser, please.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I've got a follow-up question on the issue of EU negotiations, but before that, I've got a couple of questions I just want to ask about the continuity bill, the new continuity bill that was published this morning, and you'll appreciate we haven't had a chance yet to scrutinise any detail from that, but just going on the Scottish Government's press release, I wonder if I can ask you a couple of questions around the policy intent of the new continuity bill. I mean, what we do know is that after the end of December, we will not be part of the EU, so any new EU laws being made at that point will be laws made with no input from us and no consultation with any stakeholders here at all. Therefore, what the Scottish Government seem to be proposing in this bill is that Scottish ministers will have the power at their discretion to determine whether these new EU laws will become part of Scots law. There won't be a need for any primary legislation or a need for any detailed consultation and parliamentary scrutiny of these new EU laws. They'll be imposed by regulation. So is this not just a power grab by Scottish ministers?
No, I think your assumption is wrong, and your view of it is perhaps coloured by a somewhat hostile view of European law. First of all, law cannot be made by the Scottish Parliament in any form or type without scrutiny. There are levels of scrutiny, but there is scrutiny, and clearly there will be scrutiny through the normal legislative process. There is no mechanism to do so without scrutiny, so that is a false assumption. Secondly, the principle behind this is very clear, and it is not, as you have stated, to the extent to which devolved law aligns itself with the law of the EU for the Scottish Parliament to take, not the UK government. I think that's an unexceptional point of view. I think you would have to reject the whole premise of devolution if you didn't accept that. So in all those circumstances, in areas in which we have competence, it is right that we have the choice to decide whether we align ourselves with with EU law, as we do now. And we do now for a number of practical reasons, and one of them is standards. We want to maintain a connection to the highest standards and to stretch ourselves so that we can continue to have those high standards in, for example, food safety, in, for example, water quality. So what we're doing is respecting the choice that the Parliament made when it passed the 2018, bringing back an unexceptional part of that bill, which is necessary in our view to maintain the highest standards, and of course making sure that there will be, as there always has to be, scrutiny of any law that is made.
Okay, I mean, thank you for that response, but of course, there's nothing to stop the Scottish Government at the moment or at any point bringing in new laws. This is about the level of scrutiny that applies, and given that we're talking about laws made by the EU, a body with which at that point we will not be involved and will not be consulted on in any way in terms of new laws being made, I would have thought the obvious thing to do would be to allow the maximum level of scrutiny, which is to have primary legislation, not allowing ministers to decide at their whim whether or not to introduce these by regulation, which doesn't allow any amendment by the Scottish Parliament and doesn't allow the same scrutiny that primary legislation requires. But perhaps I could just follow this up with a second question then. We do know that the UK domestic market is worth 3 times as much to Scottish business as is the EU single market. What's going to happen in the event of there being a conflict between UK standards, which will be very important to Scottish businesses looking to export to the rest of the UK, and between EU standards? So, for example, in an area such as animal welfare, it's generally the case that the UK standards are higher than EU standards in animal welfare. What's going to happen if there's a divergence? Which side of the fence is the Scottish Government going to follow?
Well, the side of the fence it will follow is the one that makes sure that aligns the highest standards with the maximum opportunity for Scottish business. That is, of course, the present situation, and that's the situation we would wish to continue. That would only not be the case if, for example, and forgive me for reintroducing the chlorinated chicken to this dispute, if, for example, the UK were to decide that it wished to have chlorinated chicken because it required a trade deal with the UK, and we did not wish to do so, then we are entitled, under devolution, to make that decision. Mr. Fraser's argument is reminiscent, I think, of Damien Green's one about jam makers in Durham and Dundee, that there should be, it was difficult for a jam maker in Dundee to sell jam in Durham and vice versa if there was different standards. There are different standards, and there are different standards because there is such a thing as devolution and devolved competence. And if the Scottish Parliament, in its wisdom, decides that it wishes to make a difference, for example, to the content of jam in Dundee as opposed to the content of jam in Durham, it is entitled to do so. Now, if Mr. Fraser is arguing for the abolition of the Scottish Parliament and all its competences, he should say so openly. If he is not arguing for that, then, and as he is a member of the Scottish Parliament, then I think that he should rejoice that there is this democratic flexibility. He can have the standards that we wish to have and to operate in the way that we wish to operate.
Well, thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for that answer. Of course, this is precisely why we're going to have UK-wide common frameworks and why they are important. And of course, as you're well aware, the UK government has made it clear that there will not be chlorinated chicken on sale in the UK. But can I ask one final question? And this is going back to the issue of the EU negotiations that we've discussed earlier. And it's a question I've asked you before, and you've never given me a straight answer, so I'm hoping you might do so this time. One of the major sticking points, as you know, in terms of the EU negotiations, is the fact that the UK government are saying that they will not, as a precondition, concede access to UK and Scottish fishing waters. And the EU side of the negotiations are demanding, as a precondition for further discussions, that be on the table. Does the Scottish Government support the UK Government in saying it will not concede this at this point?
What the Scottish Government does, and I've said so regularly to you and to Alistair Jack and to a range of others who have been great, I have to say, flag wavers for fishing. In fact, I sometimes think that is the only issue which you think the EU is engaged in, because we rarely talk about any other issue. We believe that there should be, first of all, a negotiated outcome that is favourable to the Scottish fishing industry, that meets the promises that have been made to the Scottish fishing industry, and I fear those promises will not be met yet again by the Conservatives, as always has been the case. But in those circumstances, a negotiated outcome that makes sure that Scottish fishermen have good prospects for the future. I do not believe that at the end of the day the UK government will deliver that, and I do not believe that the way in which it is put forward by you and others of your helps the fishing industry, in actual fact. I think, if I may quote a Gaelic proverb in English, it is at the end of the day that the fisherman tells of his fishing. And at the end of the day, I think we're going to discover what false friends the Conservatives have been to the fishing industry.
We'll come back to Gaelic proverbs or not. You still haven't answered my question, but I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I think I've answered it comprehensively.
Right, okay, I hear you, the two of you, but in the meantime, I'll come back to the fishing issues because Tom Arthur wants to raise that shortly. We've now got two supplementaries to deal with on the continuity bill. Patrick Harvey to be followed by Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the Cabinet Secretary. Obviously, this committee and probably others will have a lot more time to spend looking at the continuity bill that's just been introduced. But you've just told us, the Cabinet Secretary, that the policy intention of this bill is to maintain the highest standards. Policy memorandum says that the intention is to continue the role and functions of the European institutions in ensuring the complete and effective implementation of environmental law. And it also says to ensure that Scotland's environmental standards continue to keep pace with those in the EU level. So am I right in thinking that the Scottish Government's intention in introducing this bill and the environmental governance aspect of it is to completely close the gap that Brexit threatens to open up in terms of environmental governance, and ensure that the strength of environmental governance and the breadth of it, which the EU institutions have provided, is entirely continued, that we will have no weakening of that governance after Brexit?
Yes, that would be that is the intention. The bill, as you know, is in three parts. The one is on keeping pace, one is on environmental principles, and the third one is governance and principles, and the third one is the detail of the new body. But yes, I mean, we do not wish there to be a gap opening up, and this is a means of making sure that gap does not open up.
I mean, that's a reassuring commitment, but it does seem to imply that the bill needs to be significantly strengthened in that case. Under this bill, ministers would only need to have regard to environmental principles. That would rest only with ministers, and wider application would continue to be around the Environmental Assessment Act. That would be significantly weaker than the current wide application of principles under EU law. So how is the bill as it stands not a significant step backward in terms of environmental governance compared with the current situation that we're in or have been in as EU members?
Well, I mean, it would be far better to be an EU member. I mean, I'm not going to dispute that. I mean, it would be far better to be an EU member. And of course, we're dealing with a piece of legislation which will be of necessity constrained from that position. But we think the limit of where we can go and does the job. Now, I hear this. It is perhaps helpful that I hear this argument opening up now, because clearly this will be a significant argument during the passage of the bill, and I hope there will be consultation between, particularly between the Environment Secretary and yourself, to see if we can find ourselves in a position where we support and agree to these measures as the measures that we can do at this present moment, and that's what I want to do. So I'm happy to see that discussion will be a cooperative effort between myself and Roseanna Cunningham, given the issues that are in it, and I look forward to those discussions.
So the Cabinet Secretary is recognising the bill will need to be strengthened?
I'm recognising that will be the position that you bring to the table, and that you and I have had such discussions in other areas too, and we need to have that discussion.
Thank you.
You get a final question, Patrick? Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Convener.
Donald, come on, please.
Thank you, Convener. Just two questions on the continuity bill, please, Cabinet Secretary. The first one is about the workload involved. The EU, I think, produces approximately 2,000 laws, directives, regulations per year. And I was really going to ask about the practicality of tracking those, assessing those, and deciding which ones the Scottish Government would keep pace with or adopt. That strikes me as a mammoth administrative undertaking. Would you agree with that?
Only if our intention was to track and to follow every single one, and it's not. I mean, quite clearly it will be selective, and it will apply in areas where ministers or stakeholders or opposition parties identify things which they would wish to align with. I entirely agree, it cannot be everything. My view is it should be done in everything, but the answer to that is to be an independent member of the EU.
Okay, can I ask a slightly different question finally, and that's in relation to environmental principles and also the environmental body, which I think, and I haven't had time to digest the bill in detail, but I think the bill sets up. Can I ask, what is the Scottish Government's view about court structures and adjudication, both in terms of enforcement of environmental standards and indeed the environmental principles. Does the bill envisage using existing court structures to adjudicate on such matters?
I'm not being difficult in not answering that directly, but I do think that there is a strong place for Roseanna Cunningham to answer these questions on the environmental issues in the bill, the detail of the implementation of the environmental issues in the bill. So I'd be quite happy to do two things for Donald Cameron. One is to make sure that we write to him with some detail of the bill in those matters. And secondly, I would encourage him to engage with Roseanna Cunningham on those details of how the body will operate and how it will be set up. And I think that's better that it happens that way.
Thank you.
As I said, we would get back to fishing matters. Tom Arthur.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. My understanding is that implementation of international obligations with regards to the proposed the fisheries bill going through the House of Commons at the moment is nominally within the competence of, or would be within the competence of, the Scottish Parliament. However, I have a question specifically concerning powers that the fisheries bill going through the House of Commons would confer on the Secretary of State, and it's specifically at sections 23 and 24. And I'll just, for clarity, I'll read out the relevant parts. The 23 subsection 1 is about determinations that the Secretary of State may make, and subsection 2 of section 23 states that a determination under that subsection may be made only for the purpose of complying with an international obligation of the United Kingdom. Now, at section 24, it speaks on duties relating to a determination of fishing opportunities, and it states that the Secretary of State, in making a determination, must consult with the Scottish ministers and other devolved ministers. My concern is that effectively, while it would nominally be the case that it would be for Scottish ministers and the Scottish Parliament to implement international obligations, there is a provision within this bill for effectively the Secretary of State to override the Scottish Parliament. Is that an understanding you concur with, or do you have a different view, Cabinet Secretary?
I think it is a danger within this bill, as is a danger within a number of current Westminster bills, and the danger lies in the word consultation. You consult with stakeholders. I'm dealing with other governments. Then you need to have a more robust set of arrangements in place. I think there has to be an equity of action. So if the Secretary of State is involved, then the relevant Scottish Government minister must be involved. There must be an agreement between them at the minimum. I mean, the simplest way to deal with this is, we have the right, we have the responsibility, we take the decisions. But the UK government is not comfortable with that in almost any area. So I think we're going to find, as we look at legislative consent actions that requested of us, that this is a considerable difficulty in a variety of pieces of legislation. I, for one, do not think that we should be content with eroding devolved competences by giving new powers to UK ministers. And what we should be doing is accepting that the powers being exercised by Scottish ministers, that are being exercised in the right place, the real issue of subsidiarity.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Within this legislation, there seems to be something in the approach of the UK government that's analogous to the now infamous consent decision mechanism introduced into the Scotland Act by the European Union Withdrawal Bill at section 30A. There seems to be this growing pattern which in the UK government's behaviour towards the Scottish Parliament and other devolved bodies. You said earlier that the UK government does not respect devolution and how it operates. I'm wondering how do we get out of this without a complete and utter breakdown in communication and dialogue? How can we find a path through this that can, so to speak, give the UK government the confidence to start engaging constructively rather than seeking to hoard powers and prerogatives to itself?
We'd have to wind the situation back very considerably. I don't want to, and I'm sure the convener will stop me if I start sort of giving a history lesson on this, but at a very early stage, what the then Prime Minister, the convener is nodding, which worries me, the then Prime Minister, Theresa May, should have sat everybody down and said, how can we all get something out of this? This is not a new thought. It's been covered quite extensively in recent years, and found a way. That's before the decision was made on whether or not there should be a single market and customs union outcome, which was from the Mansion House speech in early 2017. There should have been a decision made about what the compromises were that would allow everybody to get something out of it. As time went on, Theresa May got herself bulldozed into a right-wing corner, and then the driver of the bulldozer took over as Prime Minister, and other people have been pushing him further to the right, which is somewhere he's never reluctant to go, and we've ended up with this Búrach.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. My final question is this. It seems inevitable that, as you've said, it will either be a low deal or a no-deal Brexit rushed together at the end of the year. I imagine that the UK government, in its pursuit for other trade deals, would be quite willing to ride roughshod over the current devolution settlement. And far from chlorinated chicken being off the table, the Financial Times reported earlier this month that Downing Street has left the door open to the UK government allowing imports. Is there anything within the current constitutional arrangements that would allow the Scottish Parliament and the people of Scotland to resist the imposition of trade deals that we do not want? And if there's nothing within the current constitutional arrangements, what would the remedy be?
The remedy is for both sides to respect each other's mandate. I acknowledged in January, at the January challenge the UK government's mandate to leave the EU. I asked them to acknowledge the Scottish government's mandate to hold a referendum and requested a Section 30 order. That's not happened. The only solution, the only way out of this, is to give the people of Scotland a choice. That's axiomatic.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Cabinet Secretary. You talked about history lessons, and I guess we might be about to get one if Jackie Baillie is going to get into dispute resolution machinery. I suspect that's going to be inevitable. Jackie Baillie.
Thank you very much, Convener. I don't want to provide you with a history lesson. I'd much rather look forward, but it's been a fascinating morning because we've heard about the complexity of the legislation. We've heard how competence could be affected. We've witnessed the political toing and froing in this meeting, never mind what's likely to go on between the UK and Scottish governments. So clearly there is likely to be disagreements as we move forward. So I'm curious, Cabinet Secretary, what dispute resolution mechanisms exist and do they need to be strengthened?
This is the answer. Might be the history lesson, Jackie, not yourself. So we'll see where the Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I want to put this as carefully as I possibly can, but Jackie Baillie and I, have a history, and we go back a long way in the sense that we've seen what's happened since 1999, and the establishment of the Joint Ministerial Committee structure. And the only dispute resolution mechanism in reality is for the UK government to say, frankly, we accept we've been caught with our hand in the till and we're apologising and we won't do it again, because there is no dispute resolution mechanism that works. What happens in the JMC structure is that if a dispute is called by anybody, it is first of all up to the UK to say whether it is a dispute or not. And the usual reaction is nothing to see here, move along. An example was the £1 billion for Northern Ireland. The Welsh government and the Scottish government both said, hang on a minute, this should be Barnetized. But in actual fact, there was a complete refusal to accept it was an issue. So there isn't a dispute resolution mechanism of any real sort. This, I do not know for certain, but I believe that this was a key issue, and is a key issue that has prevented Michael Gove producing a paper for the JMC. Because I don't think any other UK government department is willing to concede that any of their authority or power within this matter. And if you think about it for a moment, a dispute resolution procedure would have to accept, to be effective, the equality of those round the table, and that there should be some means of getting a judgment about what is the situation amongst them. Now, the Welsh have devised their first paper published when Corbett-Jones was First Minister, looked at some issues of qualified majority voting, ways in which issues could be resolved when there's a dispute, whether there should be the requirement for 1, 2 or more devolved governments to weigh in on something. It is complex, but I think you could find a way to do it. It's not as good, you would not expect me to say it's as good as just all being equal and all being independent, but there should be a way to do it. But I don't think there's any commitment from the UK to do it.
Convener, my final question, if I may. Joint ministerial committees, in my experience, were always about coordinating policy, and the example I think of is Gordon Brown very effectively coordinating policy across all the nations on child poverty. They don't strike me as that mechanism, so I would be keen to explore whether the Cabinet Secretary is likely to support the paper coming from Wales, because there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that we need to find quite urgently a disputes resolution mechanism that everybody can sign up to.
I am likely to support any move that Wales makes to improve the situation, with the caveat and the understanding, and this has been clear between myself and the Welsh Government, both with Mark Drakeford and Jeremy Miles, is that we support each other to improve the present situation, but we accept that we have different endpoints in mind, and that has a relationship, and I'm grateful for it. But if the proposals are coming from Wales that provide some progress, because there's no great pleasure, I have to say, in going to endless meetings which are going nowhere, which are, there's an attempt at civility, but sometimes it gets a bit worn, because it is so frustrating on every side. So we need to get something better. Now, I think the better thing is to do this on the basis of absolute equality as independent countries. I'm not going to refuse to support attempts to improve it, as I supported attempts from Damian Green and David Lidington to support the structure. There have been no such proposals to the UK government, and I fear that any such proposals coming from the current UK government would have a sting somewhere in their tail. You might have to look for it very carefully, but it'd be there.
We have a quick supplementary from Patrick Harvey here.
Thank you, Convener. I agree with the Cabinet Secretary that we shouldn't give up on the prospect of trying to improve the current arrangements, but it does seem to me that to be meaningful, a dispute resolution mechanism needs to be about resolving a dispute between parties that have power, bodies that have power. And at the moment, the problem and the reason why the existing intergovernmental machinery doesn't work is that the power is all held by one of the people sitting around the table. And so everybody else turning up feels pretty much futile. Surely without fundamental constitutional reform of the UK itself, which it is currently unwilling to even examine, no dispute resolution mechanism will ever succeed in rebalancing that power that is currently so imbalanced.
I agree. I entirely agree. The two issues are power and trust. You would only have a dispute resolution mechanism that worked if the four people sitting around the table were all treated equally. That won't happen in the current UK structure because it impinges upon the sovereignty of the UK Parliament. And upon an unwillingness to take part in such things. But the other element, equity, is one. The other one is trust. The EU system works not just because the 27 have to trust each other, but because there's an underpinning ability to enforce decisions. The ECJ sits there, and I've heard the current Taoiseach talk about this very effectively. What happens is you trust and are able to work with other people because you can enforce things. There's no trust because you're right, there is an inequity of power, but there's no trust because nothing can be enforced. You can be told one thing one day and the next day it doesn't happen, and you can't do anything about it. So you can't trust people in those circumstances.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can we go to John Mason, please?
Thank you, Convener, very much. Cabinet Secretary, Scotland has benefited greatly from the European structural funds over the years. I think something like €900 million in the last 5 years. And there's been talk of a UK shared prosperity fund to replace that in future. Are you able to give us any update on that?
I'm afraid I'm not, because there has been no update from the UK government. There are indications that what we have feared for some shared prosperity fund would be held to the UK government, and that the role of the devolved administrations in, for example, regional funding would be removed. But there are indications that that may well be the intention of the UK government, but we do not know that for certain. This goes back a long, long way. There was the proposal for a shared prosperity fund first emerged in the 2017 Tory manifesto. I had a discussion with James Brokenshire when he was Communities Secretary to go forward, and he promised me that there would be a consultation. I think the earliest he then said was in the autumn of 2017. Nothing has happened since then. Now, this is really problematic for all those people who are and who have been drawing down social funding, regional funding, a variety of other funding, because it's simply not there. But I suspect a rabbit will be pulled out of a hat, and the rabbit will be, wearing the UK government's colours, and the devolved administrations will be told that they have no role in it. That would be utterly unacceptable.
Thank you. I mean, it strikes me that coronavirus has actually made this more urgent, because if we're talking about regional disparity, both within the UK and within Scotland, that has probably been increased and has changed quite a lot through the coronavirus. So, I suppose I accept you can't do an awful lot about it, but would you accept that there is an increased urgency now because of COVID?
Yes, I mean, I think there's an increased urgency because we are literally months away from, the time in which we require to know what is happening, and nobody knows what's happening. It's very hard to move from one funding source to another. In this, when I was Environment Minister, and if you move from one set of programs to another, it does take an awful lot of time and a lot of disruption, and it takes time to settle in. But there is no indication yet of where this is. And as I say, it will appear, badly planned, badly put together, and entirely, the UK government holding it to itself at some stage. And the people who suffer from that will be the people for whom these funds were intended. And that's the tragedy of this. That funding is necessary. That funding has been very important in whole parts of Scotland. I mean, I know, in my own constituency in Argyll, how important regional funding has been. And, there are projects now which would benefit from that regional funding, which simply will not get any money because nothing is flowing. And that will have a very severe effect on rural development and rural improvement of rural infrastructure in Scotland. That will be laid at the door of the Conservatives.
So I suppose my final point on this then would be, is there any point the Scottish Government or the Scottish Parliament ourselves doing any work on this, trying to develop a regional policy ourselves, or are we just totally dependent on waiting to see what the UK government does, whether we've got any freedom to move or not?
Well, we have responsibilities and we will endeavour to do so, but having responsibilities without the cash is quite difficult. The issue here is, we've already, I know that a number of ministers already talked about how they would intend to streamline, change and develop regional policy. What they need is the cash to do so, and what they need is a guarantee of the monies. The guarantee of the monies that were coming, and presently were coming, the same amounts of money or more available for the devolved administrations to get on with this.
Cabinet Secretary, final question on that same matter, because John rightly raises this. This is a matter in terms of structural funds that this committee has done a fair bit of work on and produced a report in regard to that. And one of the key findings of that report was that responsibility for continuing to implement the replacement of the structural funds should remain with the Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament, and the quantum should also remain to be in the same area. If the reports that are being heard about the Scotland Office setting up a special unit to deal with these matters and effectively make a power grab of structural funds against the wishes of not just the Scottish Government but this committee, what can you urgently do about that?
Well, I think we would quite obviously wish to work with the committee to ensure that the voice of Scotland was heard very effectively in exactly the same position, and there will have to be opposition to this taking place. The most important thing would be that the Conservative MSPs were part of that and made it clear to their party in government that this was utterly unacceptable and against the will of the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government.
Okay, Cabinet Secretary, I thank you for the evidence this morning, and I realise you had challenges with your broadband, but we were able to hear you loudly and clearly, even when we couldn't see you. And this is the only item on our agenda today. I now close this meeting of the Finance and Constitution Committee. Goodbye for now, everybody.